This program is made possible in part by Cerisi Conlon LLP, protecting the future and using the law as a force for good in both the courtroom and our communities. Online at cerisiconlon.com.
Hello and welcome. We're taping tonight. It's April 18th, 2022, and we're doing an interview on Zoom. It's our first Zoom interview, and my guest is Dr. Ellen J. Kennedy. She's going to talk with us about human rights abuses, and I'm going to specifically probably zero in mostly on genocide. Ellen is the founder and the executive director of World Without Genocide. We're going to start out, she's got a story that I haven't heard all the details, but she taught in Lviv back in 1991, Ellen, is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Mary.
Would you share this with all of us?
I was teaching in Lviv in 1991, and that was an incredible time to be there. In 1991, you might recall, the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed, and the sense of change was in the air. One evening, my husband and I were taken by our host to a concert at the Opera House in Lviv, which is a beautiful, beautiful building. And suddenly, people in the audience stood up and they began singing what we were told was the Ukrainian national anthem. They were singing it with a fervor in their voices, with tears streaming down their faces. It was the first time we heard that the Ukrainian national anthem had been sung in public since Ukraine was forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1922. And that is a harbinger of the drive for independence that has been in the hearts of Ukrainians and that we see them fighting for so desperately today.
I've been so impressed with, I guess we've used the word resilience a lot, talking about the Ukrainians. Did you feel that too when you were there teaching?
I did indeed, Mary. It was really quite remarkable, that sense of being Ukrainian first and foremost. They were toppling statues of Lenin. They were speaking again in Ukrainian, which had been forbidden for decades. Mm-hmm. There was a sense that more than anything else, they wanted to reclaim that identity, that pride of being Ukrainian.
The identity issue is huge, isn't it? We're going to talk a lot, as I said, about genocide, but I thought before we go into it in more detail, why don't you give us the criteria that make up the definition, Ellen, of what genocide really is?
First, I want to say to our viewers that these are terrible subjects that we're talking about. And I want people to be mindful of that. We're talking about the worst of the worst crimes that people perpetrate against one another. Genocide was first used in a courtroom setting after the atrocities of World War II in 1946. And it became codified by the United Nations in the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948. And it means the intent to exterminate in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And it involves as I said, the most horrific of crimes: murder, torture, prevention of births, horrific crimes. But it's the singling out of a particular group, national, ethnic, racial, or religious, with the intent to exterminate that group.
And I think we think of the approach of Hitler to get rid of the Jews. And now in Ukraine, it surprises so many people that I talk with and hear on CNN, et cetera, that Putin would be wanting to do this to the Ukrainians who have such ties with Russia in so many ways.
I think that it goes back to the 1930s. In the 1930s, Stalin perpetrated a genocide against the Ukrainians. It's known by the name Holodemor, meaning a genocide by starvation. Ukrainians had lived under that forced Soviet rule for a decade, and they were feeling their desire for independence. And Stalin resolved to break the Ukrainian spirit and the culture at that time. He forced the Ukrainian farmers to collectivize their farms. And because they exerted some resistance, he enacted a forced starvation that killed as many as 3.5 million Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. He intentionally killed people within the Soviet Union, within his own government control, in a manifestation of a desire for power. And we see the exact same thing that Putin is doing today.
I did not realize the number, 3.5 million.
Yes.
Oh gosh. Some lawyers that I've seen analyzing things on television and in the press are saying very cautiously that we don't want to be premature and call this genocide, and yet the targeting of these people. What is your response to that?
You know, Mary, you raise a very difficult question, and that is, what is the power of words? And certainly the power of that word genocide has enormous weight to it. It has weight because of the international codification of that crime, and because we know that some of the most heinous criminals have been accused and convicted of genocide for crimes in Rwanda, for crimes in former Yugoslavia, for crimes in Cambodia. I believe that whenever innocent people are targeted, as they are being targeted now, we must use the language that describes the crimes. That's the purpose of labeling these crimes. And certainly there are geopolitical reasons to withhold the label, but there also are important reasons for calling out what is happening now. Mm-hmm. And I personally feel that it is of vital importance to say what indeed is happening now. Mm-hmm. I feel that it gives dignity, it gives honor to those people who have already lost their lives. It honors the words and the testimonies of those who are the witnesses. And it certainly calls us as a community of people who need to behave with a strong sense of morality and justice to do what is necessary now.
Mm-hmm. The broad media coverage that we now have, that we did not have in the 30s and the 40s and on up until quite recently, is that a big factor in helping speed up the definition of genocide and then possibly the beginning of real prosecution? Is media going to be on the side of justice?
Well, you raise a difficult issue, and that is that in past crises like this, there also has been great knowledge of what has been going on during the Holocaust, during the genocide in Rwanda, during the genocide in former Yugoslavia. But it depends on the extent to which people choose to listen and the extent to which people choose to act. Former President Bill Clinton was in office during the genocide in Rwanda. 1994 saw the murder of over 800,000 people in 100 days. 100 days is a school semester. And President Clinton said afterwards that he did nothing because not one of the 435 people in the House of Representatives, not one of the 100 senators called on him to take action. Not one. And they didn't contact him because we, the public, did not contact our elected officials. Today, I think we're seeing a somewhat different response, and we're seeing it for very different reasons. I don't think it's because the media is so omnipresent. I think in many ways, it has always been omnipresent. It's what we choose or choose not to pay attention to.
That's a very provocative and interesting statement. I wish we had a lot of time. I'd want to ask you to pursue that more, but just your main reason that you think we haven't paid attention in the past? Denial, but for what reason?
There's a brilliant book by Samantha Power, who was formerly the United States ambassador to the United Nations. She's now the director of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Her book is called A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. And she goes through most of the genocides of the 20th century, during which the United States chose to do nothing. She says it's largely an issue of political will. We have no political will. We have no stake. We have no interest. If the US has no interest, we will not act. Now, if you compare what happened with Rwanda and what happened with former Yugoslavia, it was totally different. The United States, indeed the West, did nothing about that genocide in Rwanda, nothing. And yet the West and NATO got very involved in the genocide in former Yugoslavia. The US had interests. The US, people in the United States perhaps had more connections to people in former Yugoslavia. People in the United States perhaps have more connections to people in Ukraine than they do, for example, to the Rohingya, a persecuted minority group in Myanmar, whose tragedy has been labeled a genocide, or the Uyghurs, a persecuted minority group in Western China, whose persecution is being labeled genocide. But what is gathering attention right now, and it should be, of course it should be, is the situation in Ukraine, because the United States has interests in Ukraine, and therefore there is political will.
Has there ever been, as someone who studies genocide, has there ever been a response as great in terms of worldwide response to helping a country that's being attacked like this?
To my knowledge, I would have to say no. Not like this. Not where we have seen actions in courtrooms in different places in the world, where we have seen a vote in the General Assembly at the United Nations, where we have seen such a remarkable outpouring of support from individuals. People in their households are sending donations, are trying to do their own small part. I don't think we've ever seen that kind of response to such a crisis. And I think part of that is perhaps because it's an overdue response. Nothing happened when Putin invaded in Chechnya or in Donbass or in 2014 in Ukraine, not even a slap on the wrist. And I think finally, the fear is very palpable, not only in Ukraine, but certainly in the nations in that immediate region.
I've heard some speakers and some writers say that they feel there is a real racial disparity in terms of the response, that we may not want to admit that, but as a world, we're paying more attention to white people who are under attack than we have been to brown or black. What do you say to that, Ellen?
I want to thank you for saying it so clearly. And that's exactly what I was suggesting, perhaps a little more obliquely, with the comparison Rwanda to former Yugoslavia, with the comparison of Ethiopia, of the Rohingya, of the Uyghurs to the Ukrainians. I believe that's a large part of it, Mary, absolutely. And it does not speak well for an overarching framework of ethics and morality and justice. But perhaps this can serve as an impetus for all of us to begin to pay more attention to those other crises as well. Mm-hmm. That is truly my hope.
I would think, just maybe being optimistic as you sound like you are too, but I would hope that that would happen, that the empathy that's being brought forth would spread. That would be something good. You know.
Well,
go ahead.
I want to share the content of a note I received today from a friend who is a Uyghur. The Uyghurs are persecuted in China, horrifically persecuted. She is part of a Uyghur refugee and asylee community here in the United States. And she sent me a note today saying that she is glad to see that the world is standing up to try to protect people in Ukraine, because it reaffirms her faith in humanity. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, she's very sad that the same attention is not being paid to the people in Yemen, mm-hmm. and in Syria and in Ethiopia. And she went on with a long list of places, mm-hmm. where the issue does indeed fall exactly as you're saying. Exactly, mm-hmm. Mary. And it was heartbreaking to read her note.
I bet. How timely that you just got that, and here we are talking about it. On another hand, so to speak, there are some people saying that if we push for prosecution of what seems obvious, when we see the way children are being tormented and treated and deported, etc., and all the other crimes, some people are saying that it's dangerous to pursue prosecution now via the tribunal courts, etc., because it's going to divert from just getting the war over, finishing it, getting it ended. And that's controversial. I think but it represents, from what I understand, quite a few thoughtful people. What are you thinking about that, Ellen, as you ponder this?
There certainly are two very clear points of view about this. And my own feeling is that there can be no peace without justice. No peace without justice. This is what Ben Ferencz, for example, says. Ben Ferencz is the sole surviving prosecutor from the Nuremberg war crimes trials. He's now 102 years old and still advocating for law, not war, and for peace and justice. But peace is more than laying down the weapons. There has to be justice as well. There cannot be peace without justice, meaning that we can't wait. And I do believe that these efforts that are going forward at the International Criminal Court, at the European Court of Human Rights, at the International Court of Justice, using universal jurisdiction in Germany, the independent commission of inquiry that the UN has set up. I believe that these are all important measures that must go forward now, because we can't wait. We can't wait. But I recognize that there are differences of opinion on this issue.
A few years ago, I interviewed a woman who was in her late 80s. She lives here in St. Louis Park. She had been in a concentration camp. Her mother had been murdered, some of her other close family murdered. And she was asked to be, and you might have heard about her, she was asked to be a witness at Nuremberg with one of the guards that she had been in contact with. And my thinking when I heard about this, and I think now today about it, it took so many years for all those trials. Are we going to be able to speed things up if we do pursue justice and prosecution now? And why did it take so long, Ellen?
Well, certainly some trials occurred very soon after World War II, and some even occurred before the official end of the war. But it takes a great deal of time to be able to gather the evidence. It takes a great deal of time to be able to arrest and to prosecute those who are being accused. And people say, you know, the passage of time has been so great, perhaps we should let this go. But I don't believe we ever should do that. I believe it dishonors all of those victims. It dishonors those who have given their lives to try to find some sort of retribution through the courts. And courts provide a very important piece of this process that we call transitional justice that people often don't talk about. And that is they provide the documentation of what happened. There is the testimony, there is the evidentiary fact that is incontrovertible at the end of the day. It's undeniable. And as long as we are able to find that and to present that in a court of law, that is the permanent, inarguable record of what occurred. It gives dignity to those who did not survive.
Mm-hmm. To the victims. You've mentioned 4 different court systems and courts. Which one do you think has the most power, the most clout? Which one do you think we should be looking to for movement here?
Well, they each operate a little bit differently. The International Court of Justice is a United Nations court, and on February 26th, the government of Ukraine filed a case against the government of Russia on charges of genocide. And they also filed a specific request asking for that court, International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, to force Russia to cease its activities of war making in Ukraine. So that is undergoing investigation and decision making right now.
Is that located at The Hague?
Yes,
It
that is in The
okay.
Hague in the Netherlands.
Okay.
And that court then is one country, or the parlance in the international sphere is one state against another state. So that is Ukraine against or versus Russia. Another court that people are undoubtedly reading about is the International Criminal Court. It is also located in The Hague. So sometimes people get them mixed up.
Right.
But the International Criminal Court is very different. It prosecutes individuals. It doesn't prosecute states. And it prosecutes individuals for 4 crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. Now, the World Court, the International Court of Justice, prosecutes state against state for breaking an international treaty. So Ukraine is charging Russia with violation of the Genocide Convention, of that international treaty. But the International Criminal Court is gathering evidence to prosecute individuals, and perhaps there could be many of them, for any or all of those four separate crimes.
Ellen, I've got to break in. We have only 2 minutes left, and I'm wondering if there is a description on your website of the other two courts that we can direct viewers to, so that we can also give them your website and another resource or two. Can they find out more information via the website?
Our website is worldwithoutgenocide.org. And on that website, we have a book that we have compiled, and it's called The Justice Project. And it explains these different international courts.
Oh, good.
I think our viewers would find that very interesting. And it explains the different mechanisms that can be used to hold people and to hold states accountable for these heinous crimes.
Well, Ellen, we've run out of time. I want to thank you so much for so clearly explaining things. It's been very, very informative and helpful for me personally, and I'm sure for other viewers watching too. We didn't get to talk about a lot of things I wanted to ask you about, including environmental destruction that is going on, but perhaps we can have you back and we'll do a part 2 sometime soon.
Thank you, Mary. It truly has been very special to be here. And we are taping this show in April, which is Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month. 6 genocides have their official memorial dates this month: Darfur, Bosnia, Cambodia, Armenia, Rwanda, and the Holocaust. So we acknowledge the losses, we memorialize those who gave their lives, and we applaud those who advocate for justice.
Thank you for all you've done so much for our whole world. And thank you, viewers, for joining Ellen and I. I've been talking to Ellen Kennedy, the founder and executive director of World Without Genocide. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.